Thank you so much. I'm going to prepare your questions, but I'm going to kick off. I mean, you know, it isn't my specialization, economics, so I'm going to do my best. I just think it was kind of interesting that there are, especially between Louise, Greg, and James, you know, James was talking about that actually this, and maybe I didn't understand it properly, but the sovereign state and corporations, and I tend to agree with that from experience actually, have become actually very, you know, in bed in a way. They're almost in bed with each other. And in that sense, when, you know, there isn't a purity in terms of what is the role of the state. And I wonder if in relation to that, Louise, then, you know, when you talk about the, you know, the strengthening of the state to kind of deliver this UBI and so on, what are we actually talking about, and how do we you know, I think it's a much more complex picture in a way. And I think, Greg, if you have comments on that as well, I'd love that to be kind of discussed between you a little bit.
Do you want to go first?
I don't mind. Well, whoever wants to start, I don't mind. Greg, since you're here.
Okay, Greg, you go on.
James sounds like he wants to say.
James or Louise? I don't know. Whoever wants to start.
Well, I just quick clarification. I don't want to strengthen the state in its current form. I mean, but I don't want to shrink the state either. You know, I want to democratize the state, and I think there are many aspects involved in this. And as I said, I think the landscape in the UK is really, really tricky. Really tricky, but things are getting worse. From the perspective of someone who has advocated or talked about basic income many, many years, looked at many different countries in which this discussion is ongoing, you know, and basic income is now very popular in South Korea. It's very popular in Finland. It's, you know, it's a real thing around the world. So it's not just the UK. But in terms of, you know, once you're having, say, in Finland, you had a basic income experiment undertaken by governments. In Holland, you've had these done by municipalities, like 4 municipalities. In Denmark, you had municipalities themselves experimenting with something that looks a bit like a basic income from within the state, recognizing that the old ways of the social worker sitting down with a citizen and kind of gauging what the citizen is thinking or telling what the citizen should be doing, that never mind whether it's moral or not, it's just not working. And you're not treating citizens as adults, you're not treating them as citizens. They are subjects. The state has become the employer. And so what I'm talking about is, you know, transforming the relationship between the state and the citizen. And it's happening everywhere. You know, we're having experiments all over the place. The IMF, the International Monetary Fund, in 2017, Fiscal Monitor, it talked very seriously about the universal basic income. I mean, I think, unfortunately, its conclusions were not quite along the lines I would agree with. I mean, they argued, yes, basic income is a good idea for India because the state is weak. But where the state is stronger and the administratively more capable, you want to continue these monitoring systems. Now, I do think we need monitoring systems, but I think they need to be opportunity-based. And actually, I think you will release more potential. We have lots and lots of studies, actually, now. I did a survey in Brazil on 2 different labor markets to look at motivation and the impact of different economic security streams, combined and individual, on human motivation. And it's very clear that I looked at intrinsic forms of motivation, that people who are more secure and have opportunities do more and are more entrepreneurial. And that's not just capitalists, no, that's individuals. And why are we treating individuals like subjects? So yeah. Okay. We need to have more of a discussion of this in the UK.
Yeah, thank you so much. James, do you have anything to add there?
Yeah, I would just say that I think a universal basic income is inevitable in the future. And I say that because I think all sides will agree to it. Certainly the people who are benefiting from the income would, of course, agree to it. But I think that the state and the private sector would also agree to it because for the very fact that if the income of the middle classes is going to continue to be, let's say, confiscated more and more by the upper classes through taxation, through lower wages, and through rent, then I think that ultimately private sector will agree that rather than create a kind of feudalistic society where people are so poor that they are trapped in there's no alternatives for them. It seems to me that by default we would have a basic income. However, I don't think those are the right circumstances in which to create this basic income. But I would agree that it's in our future. But I think it has to be based on many other aspects that have to do with what I was talking about earlier, which is that there needs to be greater subsidiarity taking place, and that it should. So for me, the basic income would be part of that movement. So there's much more to say about it, but I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Greg.
Yeah, is this microphone working okay? Hello? Yes, great. Okay. So a couple of points to make. One of the really interesting things about free market systems is that they gravitate to inequality, right? But they don't work with extreme inequality, okay? Because like the capitalist system basically needs everyone to have enough money to buy stuff, right? But it tends to be extreme inequality, and that's a paradox, right? So I think universal basic income will have to come in at some point to basically, it's going to sound horrible, but to give people enough money to spend so that capitalism can be sustained. Otherwise, it will just eat itself. It's like a snake eating itself. The second point I wanted to make was about governments and corporations in association with each other and being supported by each other. I think the core problem we have is that we have political philosophies that go back hundreds of years, and the left sort of lost the argument with the collapse. The extreme left lost the argument with the collapse of the Soviet Union, and I think the political parties in this country don't really have an alternative to just supporting corporations and kind of like a sort of broadly free market capitalist system, right? They don't know any other way, so they just have to do it. And they have enormous amounts of power now, and they're very centralized. So I think what's crucial, and one of the things I really wanted to kind of say in my presentation was, we just need new modes of thinking. We need new political philosophies, right? That these philosophies are hundreds of years old, and they don't suit the world in which we now live.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, I think that's completely right, and seems to be emerging throughout the day, that there are new complex systems that we are part of. And I think you can't look at things in isolation. And I'm slightly proud of myself, because I thought the basic income and subsidiary seems to be aligning as an idea. So so when James said it, I was like, oh, I'm not that stupid. So I'm gonna ask Louise, you had your hand up. Did you want to add something?
Well, just a brief comment. I mean, I completely agree with Greg, I think, who said it, but and also James. We're the current political philosophies and economic philosophies are not serving us. But I just would say that those philosophies are quite particular, right? I mean, these are philosophies that are built on neoliberal history. They're not the only ones around, but they're the only ones we're talking about. We're not talking about other development histories. Yeah. And there is a constructive economics tradition in Europe, which is both a tradition in terms of writing about economics, but it's also a practice. And it's a very different idea about the economy. It's an idea about creating the economy through devising institutions and promoting equality as a goal. And it's about these are not couched so much in terms of philosophies because they don't aspire to be so highly idealist or simplistic. But these are practices and traditions that we can learn from.
Yeah, thank you so much. So I have a few things. One, James, you were talking about planetary institutions. How do you think the way that we can get away from the top-down authoritative repetition of their form, what is it that's going to stop that from happening again? Is it that, as Greg was saying, we will have more sophisticated coordination systems that might move from the commons at the local level? Like, do we go through the scales? Is that any different? So I just wanted to ask how you see that.
Well, that's an intriguing question, and it's very, very complex. But I do think it starts with maybe what Louise was just saying, is that I don't think the answers are going to come from pre-existing philosophies. They're going to come from the emergency conditions of climate change that are all around us, and are going to be informing economic policy for the future. So it seems to me that this is a wake-up call for everyone to begin to look at the empirical conditions as they stand right now, rather than look into any kind of existing historical ideologies. That's the first point. And the second point, I think, is that based on the alternative metrics that we have right now, such as carrying capacity, there are alternative ways of actually applying carrying capacity, not only to measuring or creating data that could serve policy. And I'm sure Greg would be interested in this point, which is that it seems to me that monetary policy could also be based on carrying capacity. And what we'd have in the future is a currency that is not based on commodity assets, which have to do with the price signals that are coming to us. They would be coming more from the ecological signals that are coming through the value of our currency. I think those are major changes in the way that we will be creating our economies and our political economies in the future. And these are directions that I think will directly inform the development of these planetary institutions. But one way or the other, those planetary institutions are absolutely vital in order to protect the global environment. Otherwise, those planetary boundaries that Rockstrom is talking about will be more and more violated, and we're going to have a terrible disaster continuing in the world, which will only get worse as time goes on.
Thank you. I just had also a couple of other they're less questions, but I suppose one thing that when I entered this whole world of commons, what I found was that actually they weren't really extensive enough in terms of different disciplines. You know, how do we deal with kind of commons in a plural way? And that's what, James, I found your paper that you're now horrified by, I found extremely important to make the distinction, but because a lot of people at the time were almost like in combat with the public sector and with the state, because of this confusion between the public goods, which you explained eloquently, and the common goods. And actually, if we start to think about a partnership and a collaboration and a working together of distinct differences, rather than, and that was the thing that stayed with me in that paper. And I could quote you because it resonated with me as a community engaged person, that I always saw that they were not the same, but couldn't quite articulate. But I think with Charlotte Hess talking about the new commons, which are the man-made commons in a much more plural way, be it digital, architectural, urban, and so on, we haven't really invented them yet. They haven't fully been invented. Like, what is a cultural commons, really? What does that really mean? Or an ecological one, or And so I think, in a way, we haven't extensively created that, and we haven't, I say that because we're in an architecture school. What happens if we stop thinking about buildings as things where we house people, but as resources that support planetary care, in a way? So how do they become resources? And when they become resources rather than things we go into, then I think you start to reframe that. And I think that's part of that systemic reframing that, Greg, you were talking about, because it's very hard for people to reframe things they are very, very used to.
Yeah, can I
Yes,
pick up on that?
absolutely.
I mean, actually, Sue talked about this morning. I think when I talked earlier in my presentation about repatterning, it's not just what's out there, the institutions of society outside of us, it's also about our own mental models. It's just about how we think about things. And I grew up in the orthodox tradition of economics, and it's been quite painful to kind of rewire my brain to understand it as complex. I always had this kind of deep understanding that orthodox economics just wasn't doing the job, but I didn't have the language for it until I came across complexity science.
Yeah. Thank you. So I want to just put it out to you all. Oh, there's Alice. Come on.
Okay. So my background is in making, which gives me, I think, an entirely different perspective on these kind of questions. And my understanding is, from my research and experience, that it isn't possible to create objects of care, objects that we need, with the levels of stewardship that James Quilligan is talking about, and also create surplus at the same time. That surplus is always based on exploitation of people or planet. And I wonder how much that kind of supply chain analysis is a part of contemporary economics, and what the models that you're basing this idea that surplus can exist and can support something like UBI, like where is that bit of modelling? I'm interested.
James, do you want to take this first, and I'll mention something? Oh, sorry, Torange, do you want to create multiple questions first?
No.
Okay.
No. I'm just giving the go ahead. Okay. I'm just giving the microphone the later question.
Okay, I see. James, do you want to go first?
Yeah, just very briefly. From where we sit right now, there is a disconnect between the possibility of creating planetary institutions. There's no doubt about that. However, my only point is that I think in 20 or 30 years, these will become an absolute imperative for, and it's not like, as I pointed out, it's not like we haven't had experience in doing that. In other words, through the treaties and negotiations that have taken place really since the 1970s to manage the global commons. Now, my point is that we have to think about it in terms of the planetary commons. And the reason that is imperative is that it's going to affect everybody where they live ultimately. And I think the support for these kinds of changes in the supply chains, in the evaluation of currencies, in ultimately in the prices that we're paying for things, they're all going to be impacted by the changes that are coming. And so I think it's very important to begin to look at, we talked earlier about the price of value. I think that what we need to do is also look at the thermodynamics and the biophysical aspect of economics that actually is a better indicator of prices than the marketplace itself, because ultimately that's where the supply comes from, and therefore we're not measuring that the biophysical aspects of the economy nearly as diligently as needs to be.
Yeah, Louise.
Yes, Louise.
Sorry, yeah, I do agree that we need to recognize that we are in a different world. We need to measure the world differently. We need to measure it in planetary terms. We need to set our regulatory systems and pricing systems in relation to managing the challenge of the planetary boundaries that we want to protect and so on. But I would just also notice that we do have experience. We shouldn't ignore history. So I'm a bit of an economic historian in my pastime, And, when I look back over Nordic history, I know these are small states, and it's often said, well, we can't replicate what happened there. But if you're talking about environmental innovation, environmental governance, we, I think, can all recognize that there's a lot of environmental innovation and governance that's come out of Nordic states. And I would say that they have a very long history. And if you look at that history and the kind of institutions, regulations, and forms of ownership that were permitted or not permitted, there is a lot of lessons we can learn. There's a lot of positive things that we can take. There's still regulations as to how much a person can own, how much of a field of land anybody can own, and what you can do with it, what you're allowed to produce in terms of foodstuffs, and so on and so forth. I mean, there's a very rich tradition of public ownership and governance of the environment, and that has been part of and led to some of these modern, the export of these modern alternative sources of energy and managing the commons and agriculture and so on. And that's not to say that everything that happens in Nordic states is going right. There's a lot of things that are going wrong now, and you're seeing liberalization, privatization, some of these practices. But we shouldn't ignore the lessons of history. And I don't think we can wait for crises to tell us what to do, because sadly, I think the countries that do well are not countries that react. They're countries that anticipate. If you look over history of environmental governance, that's certainly the case. And coming back to the classical economists, they have also been referred to as the first environmental economists, because both Ricardo and Smith talked about the fact that we would eventually exhaust the earth and we will exhaust the resources, and they knew it. It's a kind of economic model that has done that. It's not an inevitable phenomenon. So, and we have alternative political economies, we have alternative sources of government, and we have had historically, and we should not ignore that.
Yeah, thank you so much. Can I just, if we're going to have a little break and still have enough time, can we keep the other questions for the next panel?
Can I just say 10 seconds, though?
Yes,
Answer
10
that.
seconds, yes.
So the circular economy, there's a literature on this. The economy is extractive in many different ways, and it's horrific, kind of the transition we need to go through, kind of implying. And Dark Matter Labs have done some great work in this area, Indy Johar in particular, talking about the extractive economy and the need to shift.